The 1960s gave us unforgettable television classics, but it also gave us absolute madness. Before cable, network executives greenlit the weirdest concepts imaginable, resulting in shows that completely defy logic. Grab your lava lamp as we count down the 20 weirdest 1960s TV shows you completely forgot existed. Number 1. My Mother the Car, 1965. Let's start with what is universally considered one of the absolute weirdest television shows of the entire 20th century. My Mother the Car, premiered in 1965, and starred Jerry Van Dyke as Dave Crabtree, a typical suburban family man whose life takes an inexplicable, deeply bizarre turn. Dave goes shopping for a used vehicle and ends up buying a dilapidated 1928 Porter touring automobile. The genuinely surreal twist? The car happens to be the literal reincarnated soul of his deceased mother, who communicates with him exclusively through the car's antique radio speaker. The legendary Ann Sothern provided the voice of the ghostly maternal automobile. The premise was so universally mocked by critics and viewers alike that it instantly became a cultural punchline for terrible television. In a tragic twist of fate, Jerry Van Dyke had actually turned down the lead role of Gilligan on Gilligan's Island to accept this bizarre role instead, a decision he would later publicly and heavily regret. The show was a surreal, deeply uncomfortable blend of standard family sitcom dynamics and supernatural absurdity that television audiences simply couldn't stomach. Dave has to constantly hide the sentient car from his confused family, leading to bizarre situational comedy, where a man fights to protect a haunted automobile from the scrapyard. It remains a fascinating, utterly baffling artifact of 60s television excess. Number 2. The Banana Splits Adventure Hour, 1968. Hanna-Barbera is famous for animated classics, but in the late 60s, they created a live-action variety show that bordered on the terrifying. The Banana Splits featured 4 costumed mascots: Fleagle, Bingo, Drooper, and Snorky. They were a psychedelic rock band made up of a dog, a gorilla, a lion, and an elephant. The show was a chaotic mix of slapstick comedy, bubblegum pop music, and live-action serials like Danger Island. Looking back, the costumes fall deep into the uncanny valley. The characters had lifeless, wide-eyed stares and awkward, jerky movements that genuinely unsettled children. Despite the creepy aesthetics, or perhaps because of them, the show developed a massive, dedicated cult following. It was loud, brightly colored, and completely nonsensical, perfectly capturing the trippy, chaotic energy of the late 1960s counterculture, filtered through a children's lens. The bizarre, echoing laughter, the psychedelic backgrounds, and the utterly random sketches made it feel like a fever dream, broadcast directly into suburban living rooms. It was a wildly weird departure from standard educational programming, relying entirely on intense sensory overload to keep its young audience completely mesmerized and slightly terrified. Number 3. It's About Time, 1966. Created by Sherwood Schwartz, the mastermind behind Gilligan's Island, this 1966 sitcom started with a genuinely interesting sci-fi premise before devolving into pure absurdity. 2 astronauts, Mac and Hector, break the time barrier and accidentally crash land in the Stone Age. They are taken in by a cave-dwelling family led by Shad, who speaks perfect English for unexplained reasons. Halfway through the single season, the ratings began to slip dramatically. Schwartz's solution was not to improve the writing, but to entirely flip the premise. The astronauts repair their spaceship and bring the entire cave family back to 1960s New York City. The second half of the season suddenly became a standard fish-out-of-water comedy, focusing on cave people trying to navigate modern appliances, telephones, and social norms. It remains one of the most drastic mid-season pivots in television history. The sheer audacity of throwing away an entire established world just to reset the plot is incredibly weird. The show essentially became 2 entirely different programs stitched haphazardly together, confusing viewers and guaranteeing its swift cancellation after just one highly disorienting season of prehistoric and modern mishaps. Number 4. Run, Buddy, Run, 1966. Imagine a thriller, but the entire conflict revolves around a dead pet fish. Run, Buddy, Run was a 1966 slapstick comedy, starring Jack Sheldon as Buddy Overstreet, a mild-mannered accountant. While hiding in a steam room, Buddy overhears a mafia boss named Mr. DeVere confessing to a serious crime. The immediate problem? Buddy makes a noise, and the mobsters give chase. However, in the ensuing panic, Buddy accidentally kills DeVere's prized racing fish. This turns a standard mob hit into a deeply personal vendetta. Every single episode followed the exact same repetitive formula. Buddy would run from the mob, get temporarily trapped in bizarre locations, and escape using ridiculous disguises or sheer luck. It was essentially a live-action cartoon, completely ignoring the actual danger of the situation in favor of goofy, exaggerated sound effects and highly improbable slapstick escapes. The idea that the entire formidable New York mafia would drop all their lucrative, illegal criminal enterprises to hunt down one incredibly goofy, sweating accountant over a dead tropical fish is hilariously weird. The show treated this absurd premise with absolute sincerity, creating a deeply strange television experience. Number 5. Captain Nice, 1967. Riding the massive wave of superhero popularity. Kicked off by the 1966 Batman television series, NBC rushed Captain Nice into production as a direct comedic parody. William Daniels starred as Carter Nash, a shy police chemist. When the city needs a hero, Carter takes a secret formula that transforms him into Captain Nice. The bizarre catch? He's still a deeply neurotic, unheroic coward. His mother designed his ridiculous, bulky blue costume, complete with a puffy hat and a cape, and she forces him to wear it, despite his profound embarrassment. Furthermore, despite being able to fly, Captain Nice is absolutely, paralyzingly terrified of heights, meaning he usually flies upside down, or just a few feet off the ground, to avoid looking down. The show tried to blend domestic sitcom tropes with superhero action, resulting in a deeply weird hybrid where a superhero's primary antagonist was often his own overwhelming, debilitating anxiety and his overbearing mother. Instead of fighting dangerous, evil supervillains, he was usually trying to avoid his mom's nagging lectures. It was a bizarre take on the genre that proved not even superpowers could cure a profound lack of self-confidence. Number 6. Mr. Terrific, 1967. Airing at the same time as Captain Nice on a rival network, Mr. Terrific took a nearly identical premise, but somehow managed to make it even stranger. Stephen Strimple starred as Hal Walters, an ordinary gas station attendant who is recruited by a top-secret government agency to become a superhero. Hal is given a magical super pill that grants him incredible superhuman strength and the ability to fly, but only for exactly 1 hour per dose. Whenever Hal eagerly swallows the pill, he blurts out his catchphrase, "Wonderful," in an excessively enthusiastic tone. Unlike the cowardly Captain Nice, Mr. Terrific wasn't cowardly, but he was incredibly, hopelessly clumsy. The special effects were notoriously cheap and unconvincing, even by 1960s television standards, relying heavily on obvious reverse motion film to simulate his awkward, stiff flying sequences. The idea of a superhero whose powers are tied to a ticking clock and a dangerous, unexplained chemical dependency on unidentified, experimental government pills adds a bizarrely dark, mildly sinister subtext to an otherwise goofy sitcom. Hal had to constantly watch the clock, creating a weird, timed, deeply stressful anxiety that completely undercut any heroic triumphs. It remains a deeply strange artifact of superhero television that focused more on bureaucratic, governmental limitations than actual crime fighting. Number 7. The Second 100 Years, 1967. Monty Markham starred in this utterly bizarre 1967 high-concept comedy, playing two entirely different characters who look identical. The highly unusual, deeply weird premise centers on Luke Carpenter, a rugged gold prospector who was frozen in an avalanche in Alaska in 1900. 67 years later, he is discovered perfectly preserved in a block of ice and carefully thawed out by scientists. He is taken to Los Angeles to live with his son, who is now a middle-aged, successful businessman. Complicating matters immensely and hilariously is the fact that Luke's younger grandson, Ken, is the exact same physical age Luke was when he froze, and is played by the same veteran actor, Monty Markham. The show relied almost entirely on the repetitive visual gag of Markham playing both a highly grizzled, unrefined 19th-century frontiersman and a modern, groovy 1960s hip young man simultaneously in the same scenes. The truly bizarre weirdness peaked whenever the two identical men had to interact. requiring clunky split-screen special effects that made the whole show feel like a strange, highly conceptual, deeply surreal fever dream. Watching a man interact with his grandfather who looks exactly like his best friend created a deeply confusing, logically impossible, albeit mildly amusing, paradoxical television dynamic that defied standard, traditional sitcom logic completely. Number 8. Occasional Wife, 1966. The 1960s were a golden era for deeply, incredibly contrived romantic sitcoms, but Occasional Wife takes the cake for the most logistically bizarre, highly improbable setup. Michael Callan played Peter Christopher, an ambitious, eager junior executive at a large, lucrative baby food company. Peter's boss firmly, stubbornly believes that married men make significantly better, more reliable employees, and only promotes married men. Peter desperately wants a massive, career-defining promotion, but cares deeply about his carefree bachelor lifestyle. His incredibly bizarre solution? He hires Paula, a beautiful single woman, to be his part-time occasional wife. They set up opposite apartments across the narrow courtyard from each other, connected by a fake, clearly illegal fire escape. Whenever the boss comes over unannounced, Paula rushes over, plays the convincing role of the loving, doting wife, and then goes back to her own separate, independent life. The show treated this bizarre, highly unethical, borderline deceptive arrangement as a completely normal, hilariously wacky romantic comedy. The sheer, mind-boggling weirdness of the logistics was never addressed. They maintained 2 entirely separate apartments just to perpetuate a massive, elaborate lie for corporate advancement. It was a highly engineered, deeply cynical sitcom mechanism that highlighted the absurd, highly ridiculous lengths people would go to in the hyper-competitive, soul-crushing 1960s corporate rat race. Number 9. The Pruitts of Southampton, 1966. Phyllis Diller starred in this surreal 1966 sitcom that felt like a dry run for her later, more successful shows. Diller played Phyllis Pruitt, the flamboyant, eccentric matriarch of an obscenely, incredibly wealthy family, living in a sprawling, massive mansion in the highly exclusive, upscale Hamptons. In the very first pivotal episode, the IRS aggressively audits the family and discovers they haven't paid a single cent of taxes in several decades. They are completely, utterly wiped out financially. However, instead of immediately losing their beloved home, the IRS bafflingly allows them to stay in the massive, opulent mansion to carefully maintain the fragile illusion of wealth so they don't severely depress the lucrative local real estate market. This leads to a bizarre, highly unusual show where a family of formerly ridiculously rich people must pretend to be spectacularly, impossibly rich while actually having absolutely zero money to their name. They boil old leather shoes for soup and wear heavily threadbare, ragged clothes hidden under glamorous, expensive fur coats. Produced by the legendary Hollywood production company Desilu, the show was a wildly madcap, highly stylized, fast-paced theatrical farce that eventually devolved into pure, unadulterated, highly unpredictable chaos before being retooled entirely and bizarrely midway through its short run. The premise of the federal government actively, willingly helping wealthy citizens commit outright, blatant financial fraud just to protect arbitrary property values is a hilariously weird, deeply cynical, highly absurd foundation for a standard, wholesome 1960s domestic comedy. Number 10. The Double Life of Henry Fife, 1966. Red Buttons headlined this short-lived 1966 spy comedy that heavily borrowed from the classic film The Pink Panther. Buttons played Henry Fife, a remarkably dull, unremarkable accountant who bears an uncanny resemblance to a notorious international spy who has just been killed. A secret intelligence agency essentially forces Henry to assume the dead spy's identity and continue his missions. The comedy derived from the fact that Henry has absolutely no training in espionage, combat, or diplomacy. He is thrown into life-or-death situations and survives entirely by accident, bumbling his way through encounters with enemy agents. The show made heavy use of voiceover, allowing the audience to hear Henry's panicked internal monologue as he smiled and bluffed his way through dangerous cocktail parties. It was a bizarre precursor to the accidental hero trope, presenting a world where global security rested entirely on the shoulders of a terrified accountant. The stark contrast between the glamorous, high-stakes world of international espionage and Henry's mundane, sweating panic created a deeply weird tonal dissonance that made the show highly unique. Number 11. My Living Doll, 1964. Long before Austin Powers introduced fembots to popular culture, there was My Living Doll, a profoundly weird 1964 sitcom that feels incredibly uncomfortable by modern standards. Bob Cummings starred as Dr. Bob McDonald, a psychiatrist who is secretly entrusted with an incredibly advanced, highly realistic humanoid robot named Rhoda. The robot was brilliantly played by Julie Newmar, who used her naturally statuesque physique to perfectly mimic stiff, mechanical movements. The bizarre premise required Bob to hide Rhoda in his apartment and systematically teach her how to behave like a normal human woman, leading to highly awkward, deeply weird situational comedy. The inherent strangeness of the show wasn't just the sci-fi element, but the deeply bizarre, highly problematic 1960s sexual politics at play. The narrative essentially revolved around a man gleefully molding a completely subservient, physically perfect female robot to his exact specifications, while desperately hiding her true nature from his nosy neighbors and his snooping landlady. The network eventually grew deeply uncomfortable with the highly suggestive, incredibly strange undertones of a man living with an obedient, silent machine, leading to its swift cancellation. It remains a deeply weird, completely forgotten artifact. Number 12. The Flying Nun, 1967. It is truly astonishing that this show ever made it past a highly skeptical, conservative network pitch meeting. The Flying Nun premiered in 1967 and starred a young Sally Field as Sister Bertrille, an innocent, wide-eyed novice nun at a sprawling, remote convent in sunny San Juan, Puerto Rico. Due to a highly specific, incredibly bizarre set of physical circumstances, namely that she weighs only 90 tiny pounds and her traditional cornet, the stiff, traditional winged religious headdress, is highly aerodynamically shaped. A surprisingly strong, perfectly timed gust of wind allows her to literally, visibly fly. This wasn't a clever metaphor, a hidden hallucination, or a bizarre dream sequence. It was the undeniable, central mechanical reality of the show. Every single week, the highly cheerful Sister Bertrille would accidentally get caught in a random breeze and gracefully glide over the tall convent walls, causing massive, highly frustrating havoc for the highly stodgy, deeply disapproving Mother Superior. The show attempted to delicately balance highly traditional, deeply serious Catholic religious themes with incredibly goofy slapstick physical comedy and highly questionable, quasi-scientific aerodynamic physics. The visual of a young, smiling nun soaring gracefully through the bright blue air with a completely blissful, peaceful expression plastered on her face remains one of the most incredibly surreal, deeply baffling images ever broadcast on 1960s network television. The fact that the Catholic Church's traditional garments' aerodynamic properties were consistently treated by all characters as a perfectly normal, entirely viable, highly practical plot device is hilariously, unbelievably bizarre. Number 13. Honey West, 1965. While Honey West might not seem inherently weird today, in the highly restrictive, deeply conservative context of 1965, it was an absolute anomaly that broke every unspoken rule of television. Anne Francis starred as Honey West, a fiercely independent, highly capable female private investigator who ran her own entirely independent detective agency. This was a full, impressive decade before Charlie's Angels. Honey regularly wore incredibly tight, highly impractical leather catsuits, expertly knew advanced, deadly martial arts, and kept a fully grown, highly dangerous wild pet ocelot named Bruce right in her busy office. Yes, a wild, heavily spotted, incredibly exotic jungle cat just casually, nonchalantly roaming around a detective agency. The show was a highly bizarre, deeply hyper-stylized, incredibly unique blend of gritty, traditional hard-boiled noir, and highly campy, colorful 1960s pop art. Honey would be aggressively interrogating a tough, highly dangerous mobster one minute, and the very next minute she'd be casually feeding raw, bloody meat to a massive, terrifying exotic feline, while incredibly sophisticated, highly deadly gadgets hidden inside her everyday lipstick and perfume bottles, did the actual investigative work. It was weirdly, remarkably ahead of its time, presenting a highly competent, fully empowered female hero who was entirely, absolute control of her highly bizarre, deeply dangerous, heavily gadget-filled professional environment. The inclusion of a genuinely dangerous, completely unpredictable wild animal as a comedic, highly unusual sidekick in a serious, traditional detective drama is an undeniably, profoundly weird creative choice that gave the show a highly surreal, deeply hallucinatory, almost dreamlike quality. Number 14. The Monkees, 1966. Most people remember the Monkees as a goofy, manufactured Beatles knockoff. But the later seasons of the show morphed into something incredibly weird. Initially created by producers as a sitcom about a fake rock band, the four actual musicians eventually rebelled. By the second season, they demanded creative control and started directing their own episodes. The show abruptly abandoned traditional sitcom plotting in favor of psychedelic, non-linear, avant-garde comedy. Episodes were suddenly filled with subversive anti-war statements, fourth wall breaks, experimental film techniques, and visual homages to underground cinema. They invited counterculture figures like Frank Zappa onto the show to have bizarre, improvisational conversations. It remains one of the only times in television history where a manufactured pop product violently hijacked its own format to broadcast surreal, subversive art to millions of teenagers. The transition from standard goofy sitcom to full-blown psychedelic hallucination was jarring and deeply weird for mainstream audiences. It completely abandoned any pretense of reality, turning into a weekly experimental film project disguised as a teeny-bopper music show, fundamentally altering the landscape of television comedy forever. Number 15. The Wild Wild West, 1965. The Wild Wild West was technically a Western, but in practice, it was one of the strangest genre mashups ever conceived by network television. Robert Conrad played James West, a suave federal agent in the post-Civil War era, who acted exactly like James Bond. Alongside his brilliant partner, the master of disguise Artemis Gordon, West traveled the country in a customized high-tech train called the Wanderer. The villains they faced weren't standard Western outlaws. They were bizarre mad scientists with names like Dr. Loveless, a brilliant but evil dwarf who built steampunk robots, atomic weapons, and hallucinogenic gases. The show regularly featured walking coffins, magnetic boots, and bizarre mind control devices. It was essentially pure science fiction masquerading as a traditional cowboy show. The bizarre, anachronistic technology and gothic, horror-tinged villains made it deeply unique. It eventually grew so intensely violent and weirdly surreal that Congress actually held official hearings on television violence, using this show as a primary example. The combination of dusty Wild West saloons and bizarre futuristic laser weaponry created a deeply weird tonal dissonance that has never been successfully replicated. The sheer absurdity of watching a cowboy deflect a laser beam with a metal saloon door perfectly encapsulates the bizarre, anything-goes mentality of 60s television programming. Number 16. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, 1967. On the surface, a standard variety show hosted by two clean-cut folk-singing brothers seems like the least weird thing on this list. But the volatile cultural context of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour turned it into one of the most subversive, bizarrely confrontational programs of the entire decade. Tom and Dick Smothers brilliantly used their seemingly wholesome, musical platform to smuggle vicious, anti-establishment satire directly into suburban American living rooms. Tom would engage in lengthy, rambling, seemingly childish arguments with his brother that subtly but effectively dismantled conservative political talking points. They boldly invited controversial counterculture figures like Joan Baez to speak out against the Vietnam War, and they aired draft card-burning skits while the actual war was still raging. The absolute weirdest aspect was the psychological warfare between the comedians and the terrified CBS network censors. Every single week, the brothers would intentionally push the boundaries of what was allowed, resulting in entire segments being abruptly cut by nervous executives. It was a surreal, weekly battle for the soul of American television, blurring the lines between comedy, political activism, and sheer administrative chaos in a way that was completely unprecedented. This meta-battle behind the scenes became just as compelling as the comedy itself. Number 17. Dark Shadows, 1966. Dark Shadows began its run in 1966 as a standard, supremely boring, and highly conventional Gothic soap opera. But as ratings plummeted, the desperate producers made a completely unhinged decision. They abruptly introduced a vampire. Barnabas Collins arrived on the scene, and the show's narrative went entirely off the rails. Suddenly, the daytime soap opera was heavily populated by werewolves, witches, warlocks, zombies, and parallel universe doppelgangers. The characters regularly time-traveled back to the year 1795 to actively participate in witch trials, or forward to apocalyptic futures. Because it was shot live on tape on a remarkably tiny budget, the show quickly developed an intensely surreal, nightmarish quality. Actors would frequently forget their lines and visibly panic on camera. Boom microphones would drop into the frame and just stay there. Props would fall over, and nobody would ever break character. It was a campy, low-budget masterpiece of horror that terrified children after school while presenting surprisingly adult themes of guilt, resurrection, and cosmic doom. The sheer volume of supernatural insanity packed into a daytime broadcast remains one of the weirdest achievements in television history. It proved that audiences would eagerly embrace the bizarre during their afternoon routines. Number 18. The Invaders, 1967. In a decade obsessed with space exploration, this show offered nothing but dread. Most 1960s science fiction shows were bright, optimistic affairs, featuring heroic astronauts, cheerfully exploring the cosmos. The Invaders, premiering in 1967, was a bleak, paranoid nightmare that felt completely out of place in prime time. Roy Thinnes starred as David Vincent, an ordinary architect who accidentally stumbles upon a massive plot by aliens from a dying galaxy to conquer Earth. The aliens look exactly like humans, but they have a mutated pinky finger and completely lack a pulse. The absolute weirdest, most depressing aspect of the show is that David is entirely alone in his quest. No one believes him. He cannot go to the police, who just think he is clinically insane. He cannot go to the government, which may already be heavily infiltrated. Every single episode ends with David stopping a localized alien threat, but the overall invasion continues completely unabated. The aliens would die in bizarre ways, melting into glowing green puddles when exposed to standard radiation. It was a relentless, downbeat, deeply weird series that captured the cynical, conspiratorial anxiety of the late 1960s better than almost anything else on television. Number 19. The Prisoner, 1967. There is weird television, and then there is The Prisoner, a 1967 show that entirely transcended the medium to become a surreal, philosophical fever dream. Patrick McGoohan starred as an unnamed British intelligence agent who abruptly and angrily resigns from his highly classified position. Before he can even leave the country, he is gassed in his own apartment and wakes up in The Village, a picturesque, bizarre seaside resort town from which there is absolutely no escape. He is stripped of his name and renamed only as Number 6. The village is populated by other former agents and political dissidents, all tightly controlled by an ever-changing, menacing Number 2. The show completely abandoned traditional narrative logic in favor of psychological torture, psychedelic imagery, and intense debates about free will versus societal conformity. The enforcers in the village were rovers, which were literally just giant, suffocating white weather balloons that aggressively chased people across the beach. The series finale is arguably the most bizarre, incomprehensible ending in television history, featuring a masked tribunal, a rocket launch, and a gorilla driving a truck. It defied every conceivable expectation of 1960s broadcasting. It remains a stunningly bizarre masterpiece that still confounds viewers to this very day. Number 20. The Avengers, 1966. While known in Britain slightly earlier, American audiences were formally introduced to The Avengers in 1966, and they had absolutely no idea what to make of it. This wasn't a superhero show at all. It was a highly bizarre, avant-garde spy series that operated entirely on its own unique dream logic. Patrick Macnee played John Steed, a bowler-hatted, umbrella-carrying, unflappable British gentleman, perfectly paired with the brilliant, leather-clad, judo-chopping Emma Peel, played by the iconic Diana Rigg. The true weirdness lay entirely in the villains and their convoluted plots. Steed and Peel didn't fight standard Soviet spies. Instead, they fought eccentric, aristocratic madmen with completely and utterly absurd, highly specific obsessions. In one bizarre episode, a villain tries to control the weather using a massive machine hidden inside a toy factory. In another, a villain creates exact robotic duplicates of high-ranking British officials. The show was beautifully filmed in vibrant pop art colors, with characters delivering dry, witty dialogue while engaging in bizarre, choreographed sword fights in miniature golf courses. It treated the surreal and the absurd as completely mundane, creating an atmosphere of stylish, psychedelic weirdness that has never been successfully replicated on American television. From resurrected automobiles to surreal spy villages, the 1960s proved that television had absolutely no boundaries. Which of these bizarre shows do you actually remember watching? Let us know down below. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next bizarre video.